Hello, welcome to Life Matters. I'm your host, Brendan O'Connell. Well, we have today with us the co-founder of an organization that has come about in the last few years called Online for Life, and they're doing a terrific job using a lot of business practices to expand the voice of the pro-life movement and also the voice of the unborn. And our guest today is a co-founder of Online for Life, and he's also an author who's written a book that we're going to discuss his book today on the show. His name is Brian Fisher. Well, welcome, Brian.
Oh, hello. Thanks so much for having me on.
Brian, you have a book entitled Abortion, the Ultimate Exploitation of Women, that men started it, men oppress with it, and men can end it. I'd first like to ask you about the particular book. Why is it that you... Well, first let me ask you, how did you ever get involved in the pro-life movement?
Well, I'm a businessman. I grew up in Pennsylvania and was involved in the financial services world for many years, and through a process of really just getting educated about what abortion was, became more passionate and more interested. And it was in 2007 that we began to test the idea of reaching out to women who were at risk to abort online. And that test resulted in several years of continuing to look at it, and eventually in 2009 I opened up Online for Life as a kind of a side project. I was still in the business world, and then a few years after that, God was gracious enough to allow us to go full-time, and today we have 77 employees in 5 states and are working to rescue children and families from abortion all over the country. It's a really remarkable story of just God pulling me out of the business world to do this work.
Mm-hmm. And then how did you decide to write this particular book? Because most people, when they think of the abortion movement, they think of Margaret Sanger, and they kind of say Margaret Sanger, eugenics, and moving on to euthanasia, contraception, eugenics. How is it that you believe, and what led you to believe that men started it? How exactly do you state your case in the book?
A few of us were sitting in an office one day trying to explore the various lies about abortion that have been so effectively propagated throughout our culture, and we began to list out the lies that we thought were the most pernicious and damaging to society, and the first one was that abortion is a women's issue. And so I set out to try to explore, A, why it was a lie, and B, how it's manifested itself in our society. And that eventually led to the book. I started doing research and tried to understand how abortion became legalized in America and who was actually pushing it and what were the origins of abortion rights in our country. And then even today, still, how is abortion pushed onto our culture? And I discovered that the majority of players in this very evil game are men. Margaret Sanger is really the only prominent woman I found in the entire history of the abortion movement, and even she, by her own admission, was very heavily influenced by very strong men. And so I wanted to cast as much truth on this myth that abortion is a women's issue, and the more I studied it, the more I realized that men are really the drivers behind the epidemic in our culture today.
Well, let me ask you, there's a gentleman named Lothrop Stoddard. How did he influence the whole advent of abortion here in America?
Well, you have Stoddard. You can even go back farther than that. You can look at Darwin. So Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, was a huge proponent of evolution, and he saw evolution applied to humanity, and he drove an effort that really propelled the eugenics movement. He was heavily influenced by Darwin, obviously, but also influenced a gentleman named Havelock Ellis, who was a contemporary of Margaret Sanger. You have this chain of events that moves through time, and Stoddard was influenced by the same elements. And of the 4 or 5 people I just mentioned, most of them are male. And those gentlemen understood that by taking Darwinian thought and applying it to humans, you now had justification for eugenics. You could rightfully say that some races or some people groups are worth less than others, scientifically speaking, because in the absence of a creator, of course, we as humans presumably have the ability to value humans however we want. And that sort of thinking, that eugenics thinking, population control, all those elements trickled down through the 20th century, influenced by Hitler and Nazism, and continued to propel itself into the 60s and 70s when abortion finally became legal.
And I know that the people like Havelock Ellis, they shied away from more inflammatory words like eugenics to use words like population control. And in reading your book, also there were people in it that said, well, we don't want to make this look like the white man saying we need to eliminate people of color, so that they wanted to involve the United Nations. How did that come about? Who was a proponent of that to try to push eugenics around the world, really, and also to try to eliminate Negroes and now Hispanics here in the United States?
The eugenics movement is deeply tied to racism. It's obvious to those of us who have studied it, but some folks don't recognize population control as just another example of eugenics. Eugenics was a term that was accepted and readily available prior to World War II. Once World War II ended and Americans and the world saw the trauma, the devastation of the Nazi concentration camps, that term quickly fell out of favor because it was painfully evident that Hitler all along had been a rabid eugenicist and was attempting to eradicate Jews and to some degree Christians from Western Europe. And so the eugenics movement, in essence, went underground and remarketed itself and came out as population control and some other germane terms that were intended to sound nice. But, unfortunately, the folks behind these movements have typically been wealthy white people. The Rockefeller family is deeply tied to the eugenics movement for several generations, and were involved in the Nixon administration and other areas of history. But white men in positions of substantial power, substantial wealth, who have deeply racist tendencies, have found some very creative ways to mask their racism using sterile terminology like population control, and using government funds, using media, using all different kinds of ways to influence culture. And today, of course, you will find no greater example of a people group that is more discriminated against publicly than preborn children. We treat them as a society as property, much the same way that Hitler treated Jews, or that unfortunately throughout history men have treated women. And today, if you really dissect the way that we treat preborn children, you begin to recognize the similar sort of patterns. We've removed their value. We question their humanity. We call them fetuses and embryos instead of people and humans. We've changed the terminology. All these are very subtle, effective marketing tactics to discriminate against a people group that have been employed, quite frankly, for centuries.
Mm-hmm. I noticed when in reading your book that one of the most well-known feminists, Betty Friedan, that they had enlisted, was it, I'm not sure if it was Guttmacher or Lawrence Lader, had enlisted Friedan, maybe it was Bernard Nathanson, trying to influence Friedan to buy into contraception and abortion, and that she later on rebuked it from what I read in your book, which was quite interesting. Why was that?
Well, it was Lawrence Lader, who was a journalist who was rabid about abortion rights, and Bernard Nathanson, the gynecologist, who of course later converted and became pro-life. But those two gentlemen formed an organization and were attempting to find various feminists to enlist. And in the book, I quote them. They knew exactly what they were doing. They understood that they couldn't push abortion rights as men. They needed women to join them in that fight. And Betty Friedan, who was an early advocate, National Organization of Women, obviously, abortion wasn't even on their platform. They brought it onto the platform, and of course today it's still there. And she basically later bemoaned the fact that she felt as if the feminist movement and now we're becoming just voice pieces for abortion rights. Her comment, she certainly wasn't against abortion rights, but she thought that it had become so one-sided that women who were pro-abortion and women who were pro-life should attempt to find some common ground, and to some degree perhaps she realized that she had been used by these men to sort of trumpet their cause. That, unfortunately, is the history of the abortion movement in America. Men finding vulnerable women and using them to be the mouthpieces, the voice pieces, and the proponents of their cause. And today, of course, that has been so successful that abortion being a women's right, quote unquote, isn't even questioned. We even assume, even those of us in the church and those of us who are pro-life have been educated, taught that abortion is primarily a woman's reproductive right, not understanding that it has been driven by men all along.
Well, I've often said that Lawrence Lader, who was an advertising marketing type executive on Madison Avenue, used the word pro-choice to bamboozle people, and the public in particular. How have women really been hurt, and how can they reverse this, to rectify this issue, do you think, long term?
It's hard to quantify just how deeply the female gender has been harmed by abortion rights. I'm engaged in debates almost daily online with various folks. Obviously, in my role here, Online for Life, I got lots of folks emailing me and Twitter and Facebook and whatnot, and so I have the chance to sort of unpack these arguments for abortion in the public square, and oftentimes what I'll say is, well, if abortion is a women's right, why are we okay with 50% of all the aborted babies being female? So we're only talking about a class of female who benefits from the right. Because if we have aborted close to 30 million little girls in the womb in the last 40-some years, what about their rights? So that clearly articulates that abortion has not been good for all females. It only supposedly has been good for a certain class of females, and so it is inherently discriminatory. But if you chart the different tentacles, symptoms, and causations that abortion brings to bear, you have a long litany of social ills. You have depression, suicide, drug abuse, alcohol abuse, spousal abuse, child abuse, self-abuse. You have emotional instability and problems. You have physical problems with future pregnancies. You have the link to breast cancer. The list goes on and on and on. Abortion is terrible, fatal, obviously, to the child. This real, genuine pain, hurt, and addiction to not only the woman, but to men. And for any of us that have worked with anybody that's post-abortive, we know that pain all too well, and obviously for those that are post-abortive and have come out of that experience know that too well. They are deeply wounded, they are hurt, they have a hard time forgiving themselves and other people that were involved. And so I would argue that not only is abortion the leading cause of death in America and therefore bad for women, it is most likely at the root of many of the ills which inflict women today. And so in no way, shape, or form can be considered to be something that was positive at all for women over the last 42, 43 years.
Well, Brian, how do you have organizations, the abortion movement went after, I think, first to ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and, for instance, the American Psychological Association here in Boston, and right before the Democratic Convention in 2008, said that abortion has minimal consequences. Now, I've had Priscilla Coleman on this show and others that say that is not true and that it has major consequences. How do we rectify this? I mean, they're going after the key organizations, their strategy. How do we end it? How do we overturn? I know we have APLOG, which is a subset of ACOG, American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists. How do we defeat or make these organizations see the truth as to what abortion really is?
I think we take a cue from a person in history who is my personal hero, and that's William Wilberforce. If you consider William Wilberforce being born at a time in England when slavery was a 5,000-year accepted tradition that no one questioned, and in the space of one lifetime, Wilberforce and the Clapham sect and his societies ended up turning England on its head and making slavery unthinkable and illegal by the time that he passed away, we see a model for how you turn a culture from being one that prizes death to one that prizes life. Wilberforce was masterful at working in all phases of culture and society to drive truth. So he used Parliament, he used the church, he used social societies, he used culture, he used the arts. He looked at all 7 spheres of existence in culture and launched initiatives into all of them in order to drive home education. And so where the abortion movement has been extremely successful at this, by the way, the reality is there is nothing truthful about abortion. There is not one thing about the abortion industry based on truth. So how do we as a pro-life community inject truth, as Wilberforce did, in the 7 spheres of influence in our culture? Well, we've seen a recent example of that. We see these Planned Parenthood videos that the Center for Medical Progress has launched that are bringing truth to bear on the practice of abortion and the selling of baby parts to highest bidders, presumably, and we're seeing the impact of that in media. We're seeing now the impact of that on government. We're beginning to see the impact of those videos in education. There's opportunities to leverage these truth points and to drive them into different spheres of influence. And really, the beauty of today's society is that we are no longer enslaved, as it were, to 3 major news networks to get our information. We have access to what I call the democratization of American media. Media is now in the hands of us to a large degree. It's on Twitter, it's on Instagram, it's on Facebook, it's in mobile devices, it's in tablets, in all sorts of different ways that we as individuals can communicate. And that's what we have to do. We have to use our spheres of influence to communicate truth in a strategic, winsome manner, as Wilberforce did, and ultimately we will be successful.
Mm-hmm. Now, you wrap up your book on abortion, and I highly recommend it, and at the end of the show we can tell you how to get a copy if you'd like. But you say that men can end it. Why do you say that men versus, say, women can end it? What is your premise there?
Well, Brendan, you've been in the pro-life movement for a long time. You know that much of the movement historically has really been driven and run by women who are extraordinarily talented and committed. But if you sit with many of those women, they will tell you that really up until the last several years, men's presence joining them in an effort to end abortion has been missing. Now, I think the tide has been turning, and most of the great women leaders of organizations that I interact with would say the same thing. More and more men are becoming directly involved in the pro-life movement, and I make the case in the book that there's some primary ways that we can do this. It isn't that I think that men can end it by themselves. My point is that men need to join women, and cooperatively as families, as both genders need to be highly engaged. I think that the roughly 30 million men who are the father of an aborted child have a very key role to play. A post-abortive father who understands the fallacy in that decision, many times their own coercion in the abortion happening, for them to come out in mass and say, I was wrong, I should have stood up for my child, though I have no legal right to an unborn child, I did have the ability to influence the decision and I didn't. The more and more men stand up and repent and confess and are open about the fallacy of their decision, the faster that we'll see abortion ended. Now, that might sound like a strange thing to say since we consider abortion to be a women's issue. However, for a man to stand up and say, I should have protected my family, reasserts man's role in society. That is our role. One of our roles is to be the protector and provider. It also nullifies this idea that abortion is all about women, because the man is saying, I had a moral responsibility to the child in the womb. It takes 2 to create a child. I was a child's father. I did not stand up for my child. I should have. That message is extremely powerful. We don't hear it nearly enough, and one of the things that Online for Life does is cultivate that message and give men the chance to share that. But that is a very powerful message. The second primary way that I think men, whether they have aborted a child or not, can be involved is by employing their specific skill sets in areas where it's necessary. So you are doing that right now by hosting a phenomenal television show. You're using your gifts and talents in a way that's very, very powerful. God, in His grace, used my business background to help construct Online for Life. I was just with a group of 50 or 60 young men last week, and I talked to them very candidly about their influence. Would they remain sexually pure? Will they refuse to use women for their own pleasure and instead create an environment where the sexual relationship is confined to marriage? Will they withstand the pressure of culture to be pro-life in their behavior, their day-to-day behavior, as well as their speech? Those types of things that we engage in our relationships with women properly, that we engage using our gifts and skills, and that we tell our stories are very, very powerful methods of driving abortion from America's shores. And I think we're seeing very positive things happen there. And I give a bunch of other examples in the book of how men can be involved, but those are the primary ways.
Mm-hmm. I know that I make it to the National Right to Life Convention frequently, and they do continual polling, and the shift is more positive in our direction. More people consider themselves pro-life. I've also had on here Doe versus Bolton, that particular lady. She was she never had an abortion, never wanted an abortion, doesn't believe in abortion, and yet unfortunately the word abortion on demand up until 9 months is attributed to her, which is very unfortunate. Do you see an end to the what I call mainstream or left-stream media's really propagating evil with the lies of abortion? Do you see that eventually crumbling on these networks? Right now, I don't see it happening. They're avoiding things like the Center for Medical Progress, these videos that are coming out, which are very powerful.
I don't see an end to it either. I think what we could reasonably ascertain is that their influence will wane. The liberal pro-abortion media will be liberal and pro-abortion, but we see the rise of more accurate, truthful information through all different kinds of means and different venues. So, there's lots of examples, and I'll use just one. Online for Life has a Facebook outreach that has over 850,000 people now from 45 countries around the world. Every day we post a meme, a picture, and a message that drives home the sacredness of human life. Oftentimes we deal with how do we administer grace to those who have aborted. What does science say about life in the womb? Short, simple messages that propagate the idea that human life scientifically, morally, ethically in the womb is worth the same as it is outside the womb. Well, that community has just exploded. 850,000 people is a lot of people, but it is the most active Facebook community in the world when it comes to the pro-life movement, the pro-life effort. And it shows that people want to learn, and they want to engage, and they want to have truthful, factual information about what an abortion is and what it's doing to society. And there's lots of other organizations that are doing very similar, very, very good work. And what we're seeing is the influence of those organizations begin to grow. And as the influence of those different organizations begins to grow, you have the beginnings of a movement, if you will. And that movement to stop the discrimination against preborn humans, as it grows, will in effect trump the voices that are still desperately trying to hang on to the women's choice and the life in the womb isn't valuable movement. The millennials understand that scientifically life begins at conception. They understand that morally it really is a hard case to make that we're going to discriminate against the preborn to the point of killing them. The facts of ethics and philosophy and science are just beginning to seep into their consciousness, and we're beginning to see the fruitfulness of that. I think we'll see abortion ended, legalized abortion ended in our lifetimes. I think that's very likely. There's lots of good reasons to believe that, and it will come through a grassroots effort, not from the media.
I see. Well, Brian, again, how can folks get your book or access your website? What is that website, and can they get the book from your website?
Sure. Yeah, onlineforlife.org. Onlineforlife.org is our main site, and folks can come there if they want to follow us on Facebook. It's just facebook.com/onlineforlife. And they get the book at Online for Life, or they can just go to abortionexploitswomen.com. Abortionexploitswomen.com. There's all sorts of resources there, and folks can pick up the book there.
Well, Brian Fisher, thank you so much for making time to be on the show today, and we hope you, our audience, enjoyed the show and learned a lot. And we hope that you'll purchase his book also, and that you'll consider the broad mosaic of the Right to Life movement, choosing truth and goodness over evil. Thanks for watching. I'm Brendan O'Connell, your friend for life.